G'day, welcome to Space Insiders. I'm Tony Sewell.
And I'm Rob Ruyak.
And welcome to episode number 2. How's it going, Rob?
Great, Tony. How are you doing?
Uh,
I
I'm,
really had fun last time. It was great.
yeah, it was good. I'm in detox. I'm in butter and patisserie detox after the family trip to Paris last week. How was Space Symposium?
It was really fun. It's always fun. The weather was really good this year. It was great to see some friends, great to see some people that you and I have known a long time, in the industry. So yeah, I always look forward to it every year. It was fun.
Awesome. And we got a really interesting guest today, Jana Spruce. You want to tell us a little bit about Jana?
Yeah, I'm really excited about Jana actually. So I met her a couple years ago. She was a VP of spacecraft, which I thought was a really cool title.
Mm.
And I met her through another individual I know really well at Firefly, and it was at their ribbon cutting for a manufacturing facility outside of Austin for several of their launch vehicles. And great person, incredible background, Collins Aerospace, worked on spacesuit technology, and was one of the lead managers for the Blue Ghost lander, which
Oh,
Firefly
cool.
just successfully
Yeah.
landed a couple months ago. So very excited about her. Now she's got her own consulting business, so she's focused a lot on her experience working in large companies and then in startups. So wealth of experience, everything from engineering all the way to leading teams in that kind of environment. So I'm really excited for us to talk to her.
Yeah, awesome. I can't wait to meet her. So before we get to the interview, anything sort of stand out to you at Space Symposium last week?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot. I think the first thing that you could really feel and you would hear from a lot of people was this rebalancing of the
Mm.
U.S. Defense priorities, right, on a global scale that we're all aware of. It's right in front of us in our face all the time, every
Mm.
day. And a lot of discussions this year was less about the aspiration of government being able to access commercial technologies and smaller companies specifically to actually really starting to do that.
Mm.
So, for example, there were a few panels that included small satellite companies such as Hawkeye and Astranis that talked a little bit more about how they're actually trying to go after and support programs across both the U.S. as well as international governments
Yeah.
for national security and defense. And so, there's a lot of discussion, as always, around AI, but there was also a lot more around quantum and robotics, which I
Mm.
thought was really interesting.
Interesting.
So yeah, it was there was a lot of energy. There were a lot more people than I thought would actually be there,
Yeah, right. That's good.
given the current climate. And so yeah, it was a very interesting learning experience.
Nice. I'm glad you mentioned Astranis because theirs was an announcement from them was one of a couple of stories that kind of caught my eye that I wanted to talk about, and maybe we'll get a chance to pick Jana's brain on this a little bit. But there were two announcements. One, Rocket Lab announced the award of positions on two major US and UK DoD hypersonics programs. So this is another example of their I guess their transformation into like a multifaceted aerospace business. Their shares are up 13% on the announcement of that. And the other one was from Astranis. They're a relatively young private company specialized in geostationary satellites. They just won a $115 million deal with Taiwan to deliver their first dedicated Ka-band satellites. The reason I bring it up because I think it's interesting that sort of 10 or 15 years ago, these programs would have been going to Boeing or to Raytheon or Northrop Grumman or one of these types of companies. And it's really interesting to see this almost kind of changing of the guard. And Rocket Lab in particular is interesting. New Zealand heritage company, but they started in launch, but that's a very small part of their business today. And we see, obviously, with the geopolitical situations and US sort of policy retreat, or sort of challenges around trading with international companies and this whole sovereignty thing, they're going to be in a really interesting position to capture these new space sort of programmatic opportunities. With obviously they're winning business with the UK and US, but as other countries look at alternate sources to the big US companies. I know you've worked with a lot of these big guys before, and you were formerly at Booz, so just interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you brought it up, Tony, because yeah, and I saw Rocket Lab stock even yesterday was up like 10%.
Yeah,
You know, I think it's so great to see these commercial companies winning these contracts.
yeah,
Because again, like I was mentioning with Space Symposium in the previous years, there was a lot of conversation about how like we must figure out how to change and reform our procurement, processes, and regulations to actually access these types of companies. But what's even more interesting is with Rocket Lab, because they're not only winning contracts, but that you actually see their business pivot from, a very focused business around launch, what was really core to what they
mm.
do, and they got really good at it, and they are really good at
Mm.
it. Now they're trying to use some of those proven technologies and actually, finding adjacencies to make, other forms of derive other forms of revenue, but in government. So this hypersonic program, and I recommend people that are listening to read more about these contracts and what Rocket Lab is actually doing now. Is they have something called HTCDF, the Hypersonic Technologies and Capability Development Framework.
Mm.
It is kind of, you could tell it's got a defense focused type of approach just by reading
Yeah,
the acronym. But they basically have taken their Electron vehicle, and they are not modifying it per se, but they're providing additive capability. So they have an integration layer for different payloads, which makes it more flexible, to actually deliver very specific mission requirements and needs for defense and national security customers. And so, being able to, take investment in their core product and how they make money and being able to enhance it for other types of applications is huge. And to be able to do that with a small company that is privately funded, in an area like aerospace, which is very complex engineering tasks and not a lot of historical, proven ways of doing that as a private company, is really fun to kind of see.
yeah.
And the other thing I think that's really cool about it, Tony, is that they've won a UK contract around this because, again, with I think the US starting to rebalance their focus on defense a bit, and Europe is trying to see how they can, put a plans together to do a lot more reinvestment and just kind of core investment in their defense industrial base there.
All right, cool. Well, the timing to talk to Jana is going to be really good. Someone that's been at years at Boeing and Collins, and also with Firefly, and now consulting for herself. So this should be a really good discussion. So how about we bring in Jana? All right, welcome back. And we're here today with Jana Spruce. Hi, Jana. How are you? Great to meet you.
Hey, thanks. Good to see you, Tony and Rob.
Hey, Jana.
Absolutely. Rob was really kind to introduce us, and yeah, we're really excited about the discussion today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So before we get into things, I'd love just to hear just the kind of the 60-second story on your career, what you do, and we can go from there.
Yeah, sure. I guess I'll start out with I grew up in a family of engineers, so engineering was kind of the way to go. And as a being curious in my younger days, always was interested in how things work. And so space seemed to be the biggest challenge at that time. So I went into space industry, got aerospace engineering undergraduate degree, and went to work on spacecraft. From there, started to be more interested in kind of the bigger picture of things, and went to do startups and consulting from big company to that, which was an interesting change. And then went back and got my MBA from UCLA, and then started to apply that really more towards program management, business strategy, business development, and that's really where my focus is now, is helping companies both win more business and move faster.
That's awesome. You've got a really interesting background. I mean, similar to me, sort of. You got your start in government, and then sort of moved into and sort of with the Naval Air Warfare Center, and then ultimately in the last one of the last key roles you had was as a VP at Firefly. What were some of the key moments that shaped the trajectory of your career?
Yeah, I think really it was inspiring to me early on to be exposed to such complex programs and real inspiring engineering feats, right? Of what we're able to do both with aircraft systems, with some of the things that they test out at China Lake were pretty amazing to just be exposed to. I started out there in my high school, so we had a great program where my junior year I was going out after school. I worked out on base all summer, and then my senior year I spent the last half of the day was out at work. And I was doing everything from helping with a funding office that was looking at some early AI and vision recognition systems, all the way through chasing lizards out of test cells in the propulsion lab. So a variety of fun things to do there, which was really got me sucked into the fun side of engineering and learning how things work. As I went on through my career, I found myself continuing to ask those questions like, how does this work? Why does it work that way? And that sort of led me into systems engineering. And I think that has really been sort of the overarching thing for me is understanding how a system works. Some people start out in their career and they dive deeper and deeper into something. For me, I really went sort of the reverse direction. It was like, why is this component designed this way? Well, there are requirements from the subsystem. Why are those requirements on the subsystem? Because of the requirements of the system. Why are those requirements on the system? Well, you have a customer who has a business plan. And so when you get up to sort of that level, that's where I got really excited about seeing how those things play out and understanding what's important to my customer. How do I help them bring value? What are their customers' needs? You can keep going through that path to really understand the why of the total solution. And then I think, part of coming out of the MBA and working with bigger organizations and larger teams, you really start to understand that you throw people into the mix and now you've really got a complex system, right? Not just trying to design something like a spacecraft, but, sometimes the people are the hardest part.
Yeah, I think what's really interesting, Jana, for what what attracted you to this was the complexity of all of the topics, right? All these different systems and systems of systems, but sometimes there's like it's a lot of delayed gratification, right? There's aspects of it, where you see it work, but there's other aspects where you might not see the final, completed system over a very long period of time. So I guess where I'm kind of thinking, was there somebody or one particular, icon or idol that you had that drove you to stick with it, and attracted you more and more to this, and maybe even led you to think more about the business side of this?
Yeah, I think probably the biggest influence for me would be my dad. He really taught me the importance of appreciating everybody's input, everybody's contribution. And that's where you really start to see that complexity. And you look at how important it is, even the small things, even, as you're looking at your team, from a leadership perspective, everybody from the janitors to the marketing people to your, first line engineers, everybody's got an important role to play, and bringing that in, I think, helps with that delayed gratification, because you start to see how important all those pieces are.
Yeah.
And that sort of led me to one of the things that I've had a lot of fun really helping champion is what I call the super tech. So that's that technician who's down on the floor, who's done everything, right? They've bent pipe, they can weld, they can mill, they can, run a CNC machine. And those guys really know how to put things together. And they can be so valuable to a team, especially early in the process. There's a tendency, especially in a larger organization that has this very detailed process, that you wait till the end and then you show the final drawings to that technician, and sometimes your tech looks at it and goes, I can't build that. So getting them involved early and seeing how the design can evolve and how you can learn from the design as you go, I think has been.
How is that transition from like big company like Collins to really fast moving startup like Firefly? Like, I mean, there's pros and cons with both. On one, you've got resources, more resources than you can count, but on the other side, like they're moving fast. It's like I still thinking about that, watching the video from that Blue Ghost lander. Like, I'm not as big on the. My background is SATCOM and geospatial, so I'm really interested in like the impact of space on the ground. I'm not necessarily like the space exploration guy, but when I saw that video, I was like riveted to that video. It was just so incredible to watch, and it was like sent chills down my spine. So, like, I mean, how was that experience? That sort of contrast between those two types of companies.
So, Tony, you are interested in it. If it sends chills down your spine, you are interested in it.
Well, yeah.
Well, I'm interested in the fun part of space. So Tony's interested in the less fun part. I'm interested in the fun part.
I don't want to strap myself to a rocket and shoot myself into space. That's not what
I'm not saying I want to just either.
There's some unsexy parts of being an astronaut, I will say.
Yeah.
But as far as your question about, big company versus small company, to me, I think a lot of it boils down to the incentives in a big company. The leadership incentives in a big company are to maintain control, right? You've got a large group of people and making sure they're all going in the right direction and nobody's, violating any rules. Nobody's screwing anything up that you should have known better. So they tend to be very interested in control and predictability and very low risk tolerance in a big company. And the result of that tends to be that schedule is the only requirement that is flexible, which then rolls into cost and other things, right? When you start holding on too tight to everything. And so the challenge, I think, for folks who are in a bigger company like that is to recognize what that environment is, and as any good system engineer, to be able to understand what's the real requirement. Because sometimes the real requirement is helping somebody in your leadership chain not see this as risky, right? Rather than changing what you're doing. So being able to understand what's the real requirement and minimize those requirements as much as you can on your own projects so that you can continue to move fast even in that environment. And then, startups, smaller organizations have almost the opposite problem, right? They're crazy, drive and need for results, because sometimes, maybe you won't get a paycheck if the results aren't there. So there's a unique drive there for speed and for action. But sometimes that lack of process can feel a little chaotic, for folks. So, I think the trick there is to harness that drive, keep it going in the right direction, and to start to build some guardrails and processes along the way so that you're not slowing things down, you're keeping things flexible, but you're not reinventing the wheel every single time, because that can also slow you down and be frustrating.
Yeah. So how, the one thing that I was talking to Tony about before, and you and I talked about this, Jana, I know I met you a little while ago. When you're facing such a complex engineering task like Blue Ghost, as an example, or maybe even the spacesuit technology developed at Collins, I mean, these are things that you don't really have a long history of proven successes, right? How do you break something like that up into manageable parts, especially in a startup? Because I think, for me, just my gut tells me, you're freer of process, you're freer of a lot of different constraints, but at the same time, it's such a complicated task. You have to answer to other types of people, right? Like investors that are looking for quick return, business models, where you have to generate revenue, which is very different than potentially, a government program. So do you look at it differently than, say, you're building an autonomous vehicle where we see a lot of cars on the street? We know what they do, but a lander is very different. So how do you look at it differently as an engineering task on something like a Blue Ghost?
I think the way you look at it is still very similar. There's a couple things that I've found is, engineers especially maybe your earlier engineers are a little bit nervous, and they'll want to go do the easy things first. And that's really the wrong approach. The important thing is to really push your team to tackle the hardest things first. Go prototype it, because you'll learn more from the hardware or the software itself, right? Like, go run it a few times, because that's where you'll fail a couple times, which is good to fail early and learn from it. Whereas I think what we've seen in some of the larger companies is they lay out this giant schedule and they have their milestones, and then they break everything down into these 2-week chunks. And lo and behold, it takes all of 2 weeks to get each of those things done. And everybody pushes off the hard part till the end. And then at the end of the 2 weeks, you're tackling the hard part, and, forget it. At that point, your schedule's just ruined. So, getting people to be a little more flexible about scheduling. You still have to hold those hard, review dates and those kinds of things, but give people a lot more flexibility in the beginning and push them to try those hard things first, and give them a little space to maybe screw it up a couple times, right? Because that's probably going to happen, and you don't want that to be happening at the end of your design cycle.
I mean, speaking of hard things, Rob and I used to work with a gentleman, Daryl Shook, who worked extensively with astronauts, and you've been involved in advanced spacesuit technology. I think a lot of people probably don't have perspective on like how challenging that sort of project is. It's not the sort of spacesuits we saw from the Blue Origin activity that everyone's talking about this week. Different sort of spacesuit. But I'd love to, and you sort of alluded to some of the unsexiness of being an astronaut. I'd love to just hear a couple of like anecdotes from sort of your involvement in the spacesuit side of things.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, that was one of the really fun parts of working the spacesuit program. Was we had, a couple of astronauts there to sort of help and consult, and some of the smartest guys ever. But when the realization hits, like, oh, you have to wear a diaper in a spacesuit, like, maybe that doesn't sound quite as sexy and fun, as I thought. But there's just so many technical challenges with suits. Every choice you make has downstream impacts. One of the things that I think a lot of people don't maybe appreciate about spacesuits is you have a pressurized suit, right? In order to keep your body together, you have to have pressure. So you pressurize the suit. Well, if you pressurize the suit to 14.7 psi, you'd look like the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man. Like, you wouldn't be able to move at all. So they want to reduce the pressure in the suit as much as you can get away with. So they actually operate suits around 4.8 or so psi. Great. Well, when you're at 4.8 psi, in order to have enough oxygen for your body to breathe and have access to, you have to have 100% oxygen inside that suit. And so now I hope all of your listeners who are electrical engineers are all cringing a little bit, right? Yeah. Because now, do you want to put your electronics inside 100% oxygen?
With 100% oxygen.
Or do you want to put them outside where they're exposed to the radiation,
oh my gosh,
the vacuum, and the temperature swings? So, just everything is, between a hard choice and a really hard choice. So it made it really interesting to work with. And there's just so many different aspects, even down to, how do you choose to do redundancy, right? I mean, you have a person's life, in your hands, in your choices to design a spacesuit. And so, NASA's standard is really, triple redundancy on things that are human rated. But do you really want to carry all your spare parts on your back when you're walking around in a strange environment with 1/6 G, and you're maybe more likely to fall over? So there's just a lot of those really hard choices that you don't run into in a lot of other industries.
You've talked a lot about culture and sort of establishing that culture within companies and sort of integrating the different functions. And this is obviously a big part of what you do today. Can you explain how you assess company culture and how you implement culture in practice in what you do today?
Yeah, sure. There's a method that I've used for evaluating culture, and it's really helpful both when you're coming into a new culture. It's also very helpful if you're doing like an M&A type activity where you want to merge two groups together and trying to figure out where are the gaps, where are the big differences between those two groups. And it's so important too. Culture really is the only competitive advantage that a company has, I think, because you can't copy it. You can't, look up a patent and figure out how they did it, right? It's so internal and hard to copy. But there's 6 different elements that I look at and evaluate for culture. And they're really around, first of all, what's the employee orientation? How's the company treat its employees? What things are said about employees? What types of, you can look at what types of benefits or rewards or those kinds of things are there. The next thing is the customer orientation. I mean, we've probably all been places where people complain about the customers a lot. Is it that type of a culture?
So
or
much
is it
easier
more
if we didn't have
customers always right? Or
to
is
deal
it,
with.
how do we help the customer? So, just looking and listening at, what's their orientation towards our customer. And the next one is process, which I think, is a little bit obvious. How rigorous are the processes? How detailed are the processes? How deep are the processes? Are they helpful? Are they not? So really understanding how does their process orientation affect the culture. The next one is standards and accountability. And that's really, how do you measure success? If you're in a startup, you might not have great data, right? Because you don't have the systems yet to collect good data, whether it's financial or process or otherwise. And so how do you do accountability then? What things are people accountable for? Looking at what kinds of activities or behaviors get people promoted and what kinds of things get people fired or pushed aside. Those are important things to look at. The next thing that I look at is innovation. How quickly can new ideas be implemented? Are they welcomed? Are they shunned? And then the last thing is vision. Is there a clear vision for the company? I believe it's there's one of the fast food places that they say like, oh, people here bleed ketchup, right? Like that's if there's things like that in your culture that really say, how well does it stick? How important is that culture? Is it positive? Is it negative in each of those areas?
So do you have any advice, Jana, after all this experience? And I know now that you're doing more and more consulting for companies, whether it's large or small, do you have any advice for people that work in organizations around how they can actually influence some of the culture, right? It's really difficult, I think, at times, maybe even if you work at a small company and you have a particular, let's say, a principle around how you actually come to a conclusion or make an agreement on a particular decision. What kind of advice do you give people in just kind of influencing the culture where they are once they're there?
One team that I was on, we did something that I think worked really well. We had a small team. We had them kind of separated because we wanted to follow a little bit different rules with that group than maybe the rest of the company was allowed to do. But we started coming up with kind of some little mantras, and we would then just print them out and put them up on the wall, and then we would reference them pretty regularly. So things like more accurate isn't always better. So in trying to get that team to move fast, to make sure there wasn't analysis paralysis, people would say, well, I want to do the, just a little bit more. And we point at the wall and we're like, nope, more accurate isn't always better. Like let's just try something. Go make a part. That was one of the other ones we put on the wall was make and break the hardest part first. So really encouraging our engineers to prototype things early and to prototype the hard things early. So I think that, finding those little things, turning them into a mantra or a saying, you've done a good job of that when you start hearing other people on the team and maybe even people outside the team say those little phrases, but giving people that little succinct reminder and put words to it to help it.
That's a really good.
As an engineer, it's really difficult to make that transition from, I think as an engineer, you want to have all the data, and then you want to make a decision based on all the data. And I remember when I first started as a software engineer and I transitioned to consulting, I went from writing code to writing PowerPoint decks. And I remember I was in a foreign country, first of all, so the culture was a challenge. But I struggled a lot in making recommendations for the client because I just could not get access to all the data. And I'll never forget it. There was a partner on the team, and he used an expletive, but he said, which I will repeat, but he said, Rob, you just need to make a decision. Like they pay us
Yep.
to figure out, based on the data they have, based on the data that you may be able to gather, to be able to come up with a hypothesis, prove, disprove it, but put a stake in the ground and never look back. And I think it's really hard, especially in an engineering environment, to establish a culture where you're, especially in the areas that you've been in, where again, there isn't a lot of, there are very few proven lunar landings, you know? So being able to, make decisions along the way, iterate, do the best you can, and keep moving that process forward has got to be pretty challenging. I think kind of embedding that kind of mantra within the culture of that you're never going to have all the data, but we need to move towards the goal is a critical one. So that's very interesting.
Yeah, one thing I was just going to add too is, and I thought it was interesting. I think being able to like easily articulate the culture is really important. I think like Rob and I have experience of being in Amazon, and everything is anchored around leadership principles, and they're very easy to understand and repeat. So I think being able to actually have principles that are used and not just something that's in a little glossy on a nice web page that you just put there just for window dressing, but something that anchors people around sort of common ideas.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that the trick is to take those principles and make them actionable, right? What does that look like in the organization? Can you evaluate people on those principles? Can you, everybody puts them up on a poster on the wall, but can you make it more real? Can you reference those in your all hands meetings? Can you really push that to be throughout the culture? That's key.
So Jana, the other thing we want to talk a little bit about is what are any emerging trends in the industry right now that most excite you? And on that topic, because I think that the other exciting part of this industry, there's a lot of young people now, I think, that are looking for, engineering schools so that they can actually then pursue a career in this industry. It's very exciting. So what excites you the most? And also, what would you recommend to young people that are in school today or looking to go to school, graduating from school, that want a career in this area?
Yeah, great question, Rob. I know like this, the canned answer is like AI or something like that, right? But I think for me, the thing that I'm most excited about is I feel like we're coming, what I hope is the end of what I call the bureaucratic age, right? So many, especially of our big companies and our government agencies have just gotten so dependent on processes and paperwork and things that don't necessarily add value, that don't help you move fast. I think there's been a lot of pushback. You see it more clearly in our industry, but I think across the board, there's going to continue to be pushback on that. And things shouldn't take as long as they usually do. And I think that's exciting for folks who are maybe just coming out of school. So, my advice to them would be twofold. Number one, like go make and break things, right? Somebody who's had that hands-on experience, who's got a little bit of grit, you can tell a story about how they, thought this was going to work and, how it really played out and how they figured out what the problem was and fixed it and did some iterations. I think that's really valuable experience and valuable to be able to articulate in interviews, all of that. The other thing that I would highlight that I think is I see some of the most interesting engineers come with a very different background. Like, okay, yeah, maybe somebody's done robotics or coding. Okay, that's all pretty generic. But the guy who, did theater and designed sets and has a great eye for graphic arts, like that's a really valuable person in your organization. And so, I think even folks who are looking to go into engineering or the hard sciences, develop some outside capabilities in art, in music, in storytelling, those kinds of things all become important. I write a lot of proposals, and so you have to be able to tell the story, right? If you're getting up and presenting your information, right? Everybody's a little bit of a salesman at some point, right? Because you have to get up in front of a room of your peers, maybe, and maybe even some of your superiors, and be able to sell your design, right? Explain why that's the right choice.
That's a really good, actually, that's a really good observation, because I've been a little bit, I think like STEM has become STEAM in schools now, because I got kids in elementary school, and I was like, why have they added the A? But I mean, that's a really good point. I think that's a good example of that.
I like STEAM if they clarify the A as a way to influence, right? It's not off by itself, but
not just a catch-all.
To me, that's how you make it all more valuable, right? Now we're back to the complex system, right? Of how all those things interplay.
Yeah.
So.
Speaking of which, I remember, I think it was maybe a year ago, Jana, I think your marketing team at Firefly posted a story about your master welder for the launch vehicles. And I was like, that's so cool. Like you're highlighting someone that you really wouldn't, you just think of the aerospace, you just think of the engineers, like the aerospace engineers, people with very specific expertise in, propulsion or whatever that might be. But there was a whole story on this individual who was a master welder and how important his role was in the whole manufacturing process. It was really interesting,
Yeah.
highlighting
There's
those
some
types of
magic to that,
skills.
right?
Yeah.
His was great. We had another one that profiled the person who does all of our thermal blankets, right? It's sewing, right? And it's funny because you go into the thermal blanket shop at an aerospace company, and most people don't expect to see sewing machines. So it's kind of cool to see some of that crossover. But a lot of things in aerospace, especially when you're building spacecraft or spacesuits, those sort of one-off types of things, a lot of it is a little bit arts and crafts, right? Somebody who's good with their hands and just knows how to make something work.
So we've established it. STEAM is better than STEM. Right here.
Yeah, I like it. I understand. I've learned something today. That's really good.
That's great. New perspective.
That's good. Okay, well, we like to end this segment usually with a fun question, something that tries to, help everyone understand you a little bit more as a person, and hopefully this will. So the question for you, Jana, is if there was one person that you would prefer to travel with through space, who would that be?
I'm gonna have to say my husband. And
not Katy Perry.
Because, what's that?
No.
Not Katy Perry.
Not Katy Perry. No, he screams too loud when you're coming back down. I'd have to say my husband. He's also an engineer, had some, experience in aerospace throughout the years. But he's my rock, right? He's my number one. So would have to be him. I couldn't go without him.
That's awesome.
Besides, he might be kind of handy.
Oh, that's even better, right? Something goes wrong, you have someone to help you out.
Yeah, he might actually be able to fly the thing. So that's a good one to take with you. So
that's also a good answer.
Yeah.
It's usually, a pretty good answer to have your spouse as part of that. Yes.
Yeah. Good
Tony,
stuff.
who would you have?
Oh gosh, probably not my wife. That's not a negative.
I don't know if
she's
going to
listen
this
to
part
this,
of the
though.
podcast.
Yeah, I don't know. Thanks for asking me that. I haven't even thought about who I'd go to space with.
I'll tell you one thing. I know a lot of people I'll send on a one-way mission out into space. Yeah, alone.
It's got to be somebody you're willing to wear a diaper with, I think, right? So.
Oh my Lord, yeah.
Oh, that adds another dimension.
Well, I forgot to add as part of the question that the person could be alive or deceased, and so I think mine would be my grandfather, who's behind me in this picture here. He was a phenomenal person. He passed away a while ago, but he and we have a lot of things in common. But one of the things we don't have in common that I really admired him for was that he was a pilot in World War II, and he actually owned a open cockpit biplane that he flew for, I think, 25, 30 years until he was about 76 years old. And so he was very, very cool. And I think having him, he would probably be able to figure out to fly whatever spacecraft we're in. But he also had this infectious laugh and love for life. So I think he would always be just a very exciting person to be with on a long, like a very long trip. So that would be mine. Yeah.
Rob, I'm going to kill you for asking that question of me. I'm in so much trouble.
It's okay.
Liz was telling me how she subscribed to the podcast this morning too. So
there's an editing feature on this, Tony.
We
can work it. Don't worry about it.
Well, Jana, thanks so much for joining us. This was really interesting. I love a good framework too. So I really enjoyed your perspective on sort of how you assess culture as well. For our if our listeners want to get in touch with you, how can they contact you?
Probably the best way is find me on LinkedIn.
Okay, and do you know your handle off the top of your head, or they can just search Jana Spruce anyway?
Yeah,
so.
there aren't very many.
That's all right. We'll include a link to your LinkedIn profile in the show notes. Anyway, for our listeners, thanks for joining us. Number 2 in the books. Hopefully, we've got some more listeners now than we did last week. You can follow us on Apple, Spotify, and Amazon Music. So make sure you follow and leave a review too. That'd be awesome. Our YouTube channel is also now live if you want to see our smiling faces instead of just listening to us. And you can also find us on LinkedIn at the Space Insider Show. And if you've got any questions, or if you'd like to hear some particular topics or things that you want Rob and I to talk to at the top of the show, please send those to us. But this was great. Thanks, Jana. It was awesome.
Yeah, thank you guys.
Thanks,
it was
Jana.
an honor.
All right.
Great to see you. Thank you so much, Jana.
Yep, anytime.
Right,
Take care, guys.
We'll see you next week.
Bye-bye.
Bye.